Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Kadimah Online. Good morgen, euch allen. Seid begrüßt zum Kadimah eufen Ekran. Und gut Jonte, es ist heute die 6. Tag von Chanukah. Before we get underway, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners. My name is Faye Burston, and I am the cultural producer of Melbourne's Kadimah Jewish Cultural Centre, Australia's home of Yiddish language and culture. Before we get underway, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which the Kadimah stands today with a Yiddish welcome to country. Wir anerkennen die traditionelle Abhänger von dem Land, wo wir treffen sich heint, das Bunwarang-Volk von dem Kulin-Volk, und wir geben ab Covid seine Bobes und Seides von Amol, von heint und von der Zukunft. This morning's event is our final online event for the year. And how timely to be led on a journey about Jewish food in the middle of Chanukah when we're all enjoying latkes, ponchke, and other yummy calorie-laden treats. And now it gives me enormous pleasure to introduce you to our speaker today, direct from New York, YIVO's Director of Education, Ben Kaplan. Ben Kaplan guides YIVO's annual educational programming, which includes the Uriel Weinreich Summer Program in Yiddish language, literature, and culture, the YIVO Bard Winter Program on Ashkenazi civilization, and the Shine online educational series. He led the project A Seat at the Table, A Journey into Jewish Food, managing all aspects of course development from initial concept to launch. The course to date has seen over 16,000 registrations from 60 countries around the world. Also active as an opera librettist, he wrote the libretto for State of the Jews, an opera collaboration with composer Alex Weiser about the life of Theodor Herzl. He is currently writing a libretto for another collaboration with Weiser about the controversies surrounding the development of Der Große Wörterbuch. He also makes a point of trying to speak Yiddish every day. Please feel free to pop your questions into the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen, and we will get to them either during the event or at the end. And with that, I will now hand you over to Ben. Hotanoia.
Adank, Faye, thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here with you all. There are many challenges now, of course, not being able to get together in person, but one of the advantages is that I can be here in New York and you're there in Australia or wherever you're tuning in from, and we get to meet in this digital forum. So thank you so much for being here and for having me. I wanted to start, since it's festive, it's Chanukah, I wanted to start with a video, a short excerpt from A Seat at the Table that will hopefully get this conversation going. And I'm hoping we can really make it a conversation and to hear from you, your questions, your comments, reflections, memories that might come up for you throughout the presentation. So I'm just gonna pull up the video here and we'll get started in just 1 second. Bear with me 1 moment. Okay, here we go.
So now it's time to eat our root vegetable latkes.
I am excited. These look awesome.
And so we have here our applesauce and sour cream, two of the main condiments that go with our latkes. I'm an applesauce person myself.
I like a combo, but if I have to choose, it's the sour cream.
Interesting.
Yeah, but I'll do a halvesy.
Wait. I have something to show you guys, something
are?
really. How are you? Good to see you.
Hey.
I've been looking at how you prepare the latkes, and I have something that is different and new. I'm originally from Mexico, and I brought some mole. We use mole with the latkes when we prepare our Chanukah holiday meal.
Wow.
Generally in Mexico, it happens close to the posada, so there's a lot of mole already. And we sometimes use the applesauce and the sour cream, but it is the mole with a little bit of sesame seed on top that we put either on the side or on top of the latkes. Now, mole is a spicy sauce made with chocolate, and depending on the mole that you have, there are 2,000 different moles in Mexico, and it has chocolate. It's chocolate based,
amazing,
and it's delicious. I'm just going to try a little bit.
Yeah.
it will, delicious. It can be a little spicy,
Okay.
so you can prepare your guests, but that will make a true Latino latke.
Okay, so if we were in person, I would want to do a show of hands and say how many of you knew that in Mexico, the Jewish community eats latkes with mole. I personally didn't know about that before this project. I was very excited to learn that fact. And I think it helps us start this conversation to really think about what is Ashkenazi Jewish food? How is it adapted and changed over time? What are the transformations that reflect Jewish history, transformations of Jewish identity? And that's what I was hoping we could talk about today in this talk. So I'm just gonna pull up the presentation here. Bear with me one more moment. And we're gonna start to really investigate this question of Ashkenazi Jewish food and the journey that it takes around the world. The course that we created does focus on the Ashkenazi Jewish immigrant story to the United States, but I'm hoping that I will be able to hear from all of you about the very important piece of the puzzle, Ashkenazi Jewish immigration to Australia, and of course it happens elsewhere around the world. So hoping to hear from you about your experiences and what resonates with you, what seems like similarities and differences that are interesting to note. So here we go. I'm just gonna, just 1 second here. Okay, great. So again, what is Ashkenazi Jewish food? When you think of it, what comes to mind? We looked around and we realized there was all this exciting interest in food and popular culture. You can go to Netflix and you can watch any number of food shows, and there are so many online courses out there, but there wasn't really anything that told the story of Ashkenazi Jewish food in a comprehensive and engaging and exciting way. And that's what we set out to do. And early in this process, I stumbled across this quote that really affected how we were thinking about this, from a chef by the name of Dan Barber. You actually can see him on Netflix Chef's Table, and he wrote this book called A Third Plate. And what he says in this book, as he's thinking about how to reinvent an American cuisine, he says, "I wanted an organizing principle, a collection of dishes instead of a laundry list of ingredients, reflecting a whole system of agriculture. The very best cuisines, French, Italian, Indian, and Chinese, among others, were built around this idea. In most cases, the limited offerings of peasant farming meant that grains and vegetables assumed center stage, with a smattering of meat, most often lesser cuts such as neck or shank. Classic dishes emerged, pot-au-feu in French cuisine, polenta in Italian, paella in Spanish, to take advantage of, read, make delicious what the land could supply." So I read this quote and I thought to myself, okay, Dan Barber, challenge accepted. There must be undiscovered deliciousness. There must be elements of Ashkenazi Jewish cuisine that fit within this framework, negotiating a harsh climate, having to figure out how to make sense of the land that you find yourself in, and how to negotiate all these various factors. So we start by going back, of course, to the old country. We go back to Eastern Europe. This is how we started this project. And we really wanted to understand how the history of Jewish food reflected these other elements of Jewish history and culture. So this is an image from Alter Kotzizne's collection of photographs. Some of you might be familiar with Alter Kotzizne. He, in the 1920s, was commissioned by the Jewish Daily Forward, which was the leading Jewish newspaper in the United States at the time. And he was commissioned to document Jewish life in Poland. So he goes around to many different communities in Poland, over 70 of them. And over the next few years, he takes these beautiful photographs. And food actually becomes a really important topic for him. And you see in the collection, which miraculously survived for years. We didn't think we had these photographs, and 700 of them actually did survive. And they ended up at YIVO, New York, and we're very fortunate to have them. So you see here, there's such stunning photographs, I think, and they really show these various elements of Jewish life in Poland at this time, again, in the 1920s. And you see all these different elements. Gentlemen weighing herring. This is 2 more photographs from this collection. And I think these photographs can sort of provide a useful framework for us for thinking about what was Ashkenazi Jewish food in Eastern Europe at this time. Well, it was naturally seasonal. It was based on what the land could provide and what the weather would allow for. The weather, of course, could be cold and harsh. You needed hardy vegetables that could grow and livestock that could manage in that kind of environment. It was organic before the widespread use of pesticides. It was based in more traditional farming methods and not mass-scale industrialized agriculture. And because of the harsh weather, the need to store root vegetables was ever present, and to ferment foods so that they could last longer. And of course, fermentation means foods are naturally probiotic. They can aid with digestion. We'll have more on that later. But these elements are all coming together for centuries in Eastern Europe. And this is really the heart of Ashkenazi Jewish food. And I think it also shows, and what we see time and again, is that there's such resourcefulness and ingenuity and creativity in this cuisine, and that there's so much for us to learn from the Jews of Eastern Europe and how they managed to navigate this landscape. And that when you prepare Ashkenazi Jewish food in traditional ways, you realize there's this great wisdom in how Ashkenazi Jews adapted to the climate and really found a way to create healthy, nutritious foods for themselves, for their families, that would sustain them. There are, of course, many stereotypes that Ashkenazi Jewish food is bland, brown, it's heavy, it causes indigestion. One of the things we wanted to do with this course, and what I'm hoping we can do with this presentation, is confound some of these stereotypes and show other aspects of the cuisine, how rich and how evocative it can really be. So, cholent. If we think about what is distinctive about Jewish food, cholent comes to mind. Jewish food in any locale is very similar to the food of the region. So Jewish Polish food, of course, has many similarities with Polish food. Jewish Lithuanian food is very similar to Lithuanian food in many respects, but with certain variations and certain elements that might be distinctive to the Jewish community. Now, every culture one can think of likely has its soup or its stews, but Jews make cholent. It's a distinctively Jewish practice to have your cholent pot and to fill it with the ingredients you have available, and then to take it in. Traditionally, in Eastern Europe and elsewhere, it's not just an Eastern European phenomenon. Of course, there's chamin in the Sephardi tradition, dafina in Morocco and in Arabic-speaking lands. Cholent is enjoyed by Jews everywhere, but this tradition of taking cholent and cooking it overnight, and therefore creating this distinctive flavor profile. I'm paraphrasing from a wonderful presentation that culinary historian Michael Twitty gives in the course, where he says, because you couldn't touch that cholent pot until Shabbos, until Saturday, it creates this distinctive flavor of this slow cooking. And that's so quintessentially part of the Jewish experience on Shabbos. And so I'd like to think about cholent not just as, in the literal sense, but cholent as this metaphor for a distinctive way of Jewish cooking and a distinctive way of Jewishly relating to food and the natural landscape and how we use ingredients. So in that sense, what goes into any given cholent pot in any given community depends on so many factors. This is an image from one particular community of everyone posing with their pots as they're taking their pots to the communal oven, which is a very traditional practice. But the ingredients that would go into the cholent pot would depend on the produce available, the meat that may or may not be available, the social class and economic circumstances of the family, the particularities of the community, and so on. So we're all about defying stereotypes here and showing different aspects of Ashkenazi Jewish food. This document is a price list from Totzeret Artseinu in Warsaw, which imported products from British Mandate Palestine. And the list includes oranges, orange juice, orange candies, orange marmalade, grapefruit, tomato juice, grape jam, almonds, honey, halva of all different kinds, wine, and brandy. There are a number of ingredients that you might not think of as belonging to a traditional Ashkenazi Jewish kitchen, but this document shows that Eastern European Jews at this time would purchase these products and in that way could express their devotion to the Holy Land while also enjoying these delicious foods and drink. Jews also made wine, which is not something that everyone might think about as the first thing you think of when you think of Ashkenazi Jewish food, but this is an image actually from Kishinev. You can see how physically laborious this process is of making wine. And there was a Jewish winemaking industry, particularly in Tokaj in Hungary, which is known for its wines. And there was a tremendous amount of knowledge that was part of this Jewish practice of making wine. Much of it actually was lost in the Holocaust. Again, I'm paraphrasing Alice Feiring, who's a wonderful wine critic and gives a talk in the course, talks in depth about this tradition of Jews and wine. Another important element of this tradition. This image I love, the caption, it's from Lida, 1926, and the caption says, "His matzahs go as far as Warsaw." And this is a gentleman's matzah baker loading the dough into the oven. I Googled how many kilometers for our audience here. It is from Warsaw to Lida. It's 400 kilometers. So I think it's interesting to think about how Ashkenazi Jews at this time period conceptualized space and how this was seen as, wow, this is quite a distance from Lida to Warsaw. And of course, matzah being arguably the most Jewish food, the most deeply rooted in Jewish texts and tradition and Passover. Jews make matzah and it's seasonal, of course. So I think it's an interesting image. So in talking about rhythms of the Jewish year, distinctive cycles and practices, these gentlemen are washing dishes. In Poland, this is World War I era, using this device to wash the dishes. Other distinctive elements. This is a photograph of pupils of the Beis Yaakov school. Some of you might be familiar with the phenomenon of the Beis Yaakov school system that sprung up and became widely popular in Poland and elsewhere. And we have these students posing with glasses of milk. The caption reads, "Probably by a benefactor." So we're not sure. The sign says, "Lo mer gehen Gottes Licht," let's go in God's light. And I just think this image really captures so many cultural elements of this society. What a treat it must have been to have this fresh milk from whatever farm it came from as a break from study with these young students. Another part of the story that is just a part of the reality is that there was poverty, there was scarcity, there was food insecurity. It's part of the Jewish experience in Eastern Europe. Interestingly, this is not it might seem to be a Holocaust image. It's not a Holocaust image. It's earlier. It's 1918 in Lvov. And these children just received food from a soup kitchen after a pogrom. So an important part of the story to visit, this idea of times of horrific acts and great hardship. Similarly, this is a poster, an anti-Semitic leaflet from Poland from the 1930s. This is coming out of rise of nationalist movements in Poland and certain Poles feeling anxious about the stability of the new independent country and using this anti-Semitic propaganda, blaming Jews for Poland's economic struggles. Jews are seen as hoarding food. So it really shows these societal tensions in Poland at the time. The caption says, "The Jew on Shabbos has fish and cakes while Polish towns and villages break down under the burden of starvation." So very, very strong language in this propaganda, just to show this other element of, anti-Semitism at this time. This is a letter from Sholem Aleichem, written in his own hand, of course, to a friend of his, this gentleman Levin, talking about this delicious milchika fish that he had and how much he loves it and how he's just savoring just the thought of this fish. I think it's so fascinating to see how, to imagine what Sholem Aleicham's dietary habits were like, what he ate, why he loves this fish so much. It's just really eye-opening to study documents like this and see what they can open up for us. Similarly, this is, some of you may be familiar with Vegetarisch Dietetischer Kochbuch, the Vilna Vegetarian Cookbook by Fania Lawando. Fania Lawando publishes this in 1938. It features 400 recipes, and she was a restaurant owner, proprietor of this all-vegetarian restaurant. And I think what's so striking about the cover of this cookbook that we're seeing here is it's so vibrant, it's so colorful. It's this celebration of vegetables, this connection to nature, a celebration of place, of being rooted in a particular place and time. This is the place that has red cabbage and red beets and red pepper. And it's really a celebration of what that all means. So we transition from the old world to new lands. Jews are, of course, going everywhere around the world, to Australia, to the United States, to South Africa. Ashkenazi Jews are settling in many different places. And so we wanted to understand what happens in these transformations in Jewish life and how it affects the foodway. So what happens between this, an open market in Poland, and this is Hester Street in New York? And what happens between this, a smaller bakery in Moldova, and this more commercial bakery, Jewish bakery on East Houston Street on the Lower East Side of New York City? And what happens from this, which is a picture of a family in a displaced persons camp celebrating Passover, and this, a family in relative comfort, abundance. This is from the 1970s in the United States. So we like to use the documents as a way to tell the story of these transformations. For many Jews who came to the United States, for example, having a pushcart was a way to achieve greater financial success. It was an important stepping stone to social mobility. You could be an entrepreneur and you didn't have to have you could be your own boss. You didn't have to have a boss. And that helped you if you were Shabbos observant and your boss didn't understand that you had certain religious prohibitions not to work. This is obviously from 1923. Mr. Israel Bloom here needs his pushcart ticket permit in order to have his pushcart. And this was a way for the city of New York to regulate the trade of pushcarts. The city authorities often saw the pushcarts as unsanitary, exploitative, and ugly. And they were at various times looking for ways to put them out of business, essentially. So you needed to have this certificate. It really opens up this, this world of what it was to be a pushcart peddler and to try to make your way and become someone in this new society with greater financial stability. Similarly, this is from the 1910s, from an organization called the Educational Alliance, and they did cooking classes for children on the Lower East Side. The Educational Alliance was founded in 1889, and these cooking classes became an important venue where Educational Alliance social workers could teach immigrant and second generation girls how to be quote unquote good Americans. So cooking becomes this way of fostering acculturation, assimilation. It's interesting to see how, these values of, at this time, very, very young girls being taught that they have to learn how to cook well in order to be a good housewife. You can actually see, this is the roster. they're very young. They're hopefully you can see the ages here, 11, 10, and they're in this cooking class learning how to be quote unquote American. Interesting to see that their parents' occupations, their mothers are all housewives, their fathers are salesmen, there's a grocer. It's really an eye-opening document, I think, that shows what the struggles and the sort of sociological aspects of Jewish life at this time. Here's though the back end of that, which is this is a doodle from class, and I love this document because it shows that no matter what age and time period, kids will always doodle in class and use their creativity. So I love that we have that document as well. Another aspect for Jewish immigration to the United States was the Landsmannschaften. So, societies where people would gather from the same town, as you may be familiar. And this is the last banquet of the first Belzer Bessaraber Sikh Benevolent Association in New York City in 1960. And what I love about this image is just how, first of all, how glamorous everyone looks. And they're celebrating their community and their transition to America. As Jews are achieving some upward mobility, they're still, food becomes this way to gather and to maintain the bonds of community that they had from where they came from. This document here, you see, you may be familiar that in Eastern Europe, actually, cream cheese and a bagel was not something that was served. You'd be lucky if you had a bagel with butter. But when this is a later evolution of Ashkenazi Jewish cuisine, even though we might associate it so strongly now with Ashkenazi Jewish cuisine. But I just love this advertisement, Nai bagel lox und cream cheese servier set. You can get your own serving set from Borden's cream cheese. It's only 50 cents. And you see how the Jewish audience was marketed to by the American advertising industry in the newspaper. Another important transformation in Jewish life is just the scale. And you see, if we think back to that gentleman in Lida with his one matzah oven, we've now come a ways from that. We have the Menashevitz Matzah Company in Jersey City, New York. Massive scale production of matzah at an industrial level. Another important transformation. So borscht is not distinctively Jewish. It's very common across Eastern Europe, and it has its origins in Ukraine. But in, for example, the mid-20th century in the United States, it becomes associated with Jews, and it has this association with what gets to be known as the Borscht Belt. My colleague Eddie Portnoy has a lot to say about this, about how the Borscht Belt really was started because Jews couldn't get out from the city and find a resort that would accept them due to anti-Semitism. So they made their own resorts, and then they wanted their own entertainment industry to be entertained while they were away. And because of the commonality of eating borscht, it got nicknamed the Borscht Belt. So here are some images from the Borscht Belt. This is from dining room at Grossinger's. Here's the kitchen at Grossinger's. The kitchens of Catskills kitchens come to be known with their own sort of phenomenon and infamy. This image I had to include because I just thought it was so interesting. This is Gold in My Ear feeding a young boy in Grossinger's dining room. And here is Jenny Grossinger talking about her famous rye bread in an advertisement. And I think it's just so fascinating. You see this Yiddish inflected hearty appetite from Mit guten Appetit. And it's just so interesting to think about how Jews, rye bread, there's a whole campaign for marketing rye bread to everyone, but how these ads were presented to the public at this particular time in history. You may be familiar with the image of Isaac Bashevis Singer sitting in the cafeteria. The dairy restaurant becomes an important institution. In New York City, for example, this is a menu from one of the dairy restaurants. Not really around anymore. If you ever visit New York City, you might be able to find one restaurant that has this kind of consistent fare, but it's interesting, I think, to look at these menus and see how they capture this moment in time. Jews and Chinese food. If you are available on December 22nd, there's going to be a presentation at YIVO on the full history of Ashkenazi Jews and Chinese food. So I'm only going to give a very, very brief mention of this history. And if you're watching this presentation later, the video should be available for that. But this shows how, again, Jews who were interested in eating Chinese food, if you were kosher, it might not be easy for you to get to a Chinese restaurant, or you wouldn't be able to eat there. So Stretz decided they were going to market kosher parv mushroom chow mein. The brief version of the story of Jews and Chinese food or one explanation for the affinity Jews have with Chinese food is that Jewish immigrants and Chinese immigrants both come to the Lower East Side in New York, and that proximity, you start to get interested in what your neighbors are eating, and that's part of the explanation. Andy Coe, who talks about it, will go more in depth about it. But just I think a really charming box of chow mein right there. Another transformation, you move away from these natural fats like butter and milk and schmaltz, and you have these manufactured, synthetic fats like Crisco. But interesting to see how they were marketed both English and Yiddish. Again, we see the emphasis on it being kosher and parv, and just fascinating to see. Here's a dreft for washing dishes, very similar situation. And also, yes, the emphasis on it being kosher and parv. So we're now going to jump forward in time and talk a little bit more about the present day, where we are today, or near present. This is postage stamps from Israel, actually, from the year 2000. And to sort of ask this question of how has the perception of Ashkenazi Jewish food changed? I think you could make an argument looking at these postage stamps. It's being brought out of the sort of the shadows into the Israeli sunshine. There's a nostalgia, a longing perhaps for the comfort of, gefilte fish, or a more of a celebration of this cuisine, and that it can be colorful with that beautiful carrot on top, and looks healthy and delicious to me. So just to think about how that relationship and attitude might have changed over time. Something else that is happening today. This is a New Yorker cartoon that I just loved and wanted to share here. People are fermenting all over the place. They're thinking about how to be resourceful with their ingredients. They are thinking about traditional ways of making food. That seems to be a phenomenon happening many places. And there's so much to learn by going back into this Jewish food story and investigating how Jews in Eastern Europe traditionally made these foods. So to that end, this was an article in the New York Times that Jeffrey Oskowitz, who, if you take the course, see the table, you will see often. Jeffrey wrote this article, and he made this case that there was once a Chanukah goose that was served as a main dish. It wasn't just that we all always ate latkes and chocolate and ponchkes, as delicious as all those are, but that there was this older tradition of finding a goose that typically was more readily available back then and making it as the main course, and that we should really think about reviving the Chanukah goose. So I couldn't agree more with Jeffrey that there's so many traditions that can be revived. And so this is what we set out to do with a seat at the table. And I'll just tell you briefly a bit more about the course. It's 7 units. You see Liz and Jeffrey there again. There are course guides and co-producers for the course. The 7 units present a comprehensive history of Ashkenazi Jewish food from its origins in the Bible to the present day. It features lectures, cooking demonstrations, roundtable discussions, free downloadable recipes. it's all free, so you can sign up if you're interested in learning more. And we'd be delighted to, hear your thoughts, of course. And you can go to YIVO.org to register for the course. And I also just want to mention, we have this Share a Family Recipe initiative. So if you have a family recipe that is meaningful to you, if you remember how a family member made a particular dish and you want to share it with us, you can go to yivo.org/food and you can fill this form out and you can check off that you want the recipe to be added to the YIVO archives, and we will add your recipe to the archives and preserve it digitally so that future generations can read it, appreciate it, and enjoy it. So it really is a collective endeavor. We are, counting on all of us as a community together to share the stories that we have and to really celebrate this food and reclaim it together. I think there's a lot still yet to be discovered about this material. There's much more in the archive, and you may see in the course that there are many more archival objects that tell this story. So excited to hear from all of you, your impressions, and feel free, to contact me, and hopefully we'll have a nice conversation now. I will share one final video if I believe we have time here. Just one moment. So we're gonna go back. Oop. Bear with me here. Okay. So this is Irene Pletka, and we're going to return to Alon Stavins in one of our roundtable discussions talking about this process of adaptation and how it has functioned throughout history. Here we go.
When immigrants arrive, women, who are the cooks, women go out and look for something that is familiar, but when they don't find it, they turn to their neighbors who are not Jewish, who are the locals, and see what it is that they're cooking, and then they adapt that. And I really think that it's the women who make this fusion cuisine, who are the transmitters of this Jewish culinary heritage.
I agree with you, and I love the word familiar, the way you're using it, because I think what makes Jewish food Jewish is the familiarity that food will give us with a place and with a time, that it's part of a calendar. We will eat it on Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur or Passover. We insert it in a calendar, and we want to be familiar and familiarized with it. So that impression that you're giving, Irene, of the women going and finding food that makes them feel the way they felt when they were little will be transported into the home, but the children will feel familiar with something different that is the result of their friendships, and that familiarity will change. I think that what distinguishes Russian food or Mexican food or Polish food from Jewish food is that the first three are in a place, whereas the Jewish food travels through one place into another. And that traveling, that capacity of absorbing what is in the environment and then also giving to the environment is distinctly Jewish. It's the uniqueness of the traveler that wants to find roots, but also sees backwards and forwards in that connection, in that chain of generations.
Okay, so be curious to hear all of your thoughts. Do you agree with Alon? How do you think about this process of transformation of food? And hope we can have a conversation about it. And I want to wish you all a Freilich and Chanukah. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you to everyone at Kadimah, Faye, John, everyone for having me here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shannon Dunk, Ben. That was very interesting and absolutely mouth-watering. We've got a few questions that have already popped up in the chat. An early question from Anna was, she said, the Jews had to eat fat-rich food against the harsh winter she's talking about in Europe pre-war. Was obesity a problem?
I I haven't heard anything about that. It would be a good question to ask a number of scholars I could think of. I haven't encountered that in the research that we did. I think in general, what I've heard from folks is that, you know, when you're, say, have a very rigorous active lifestyle, you know, if you're working on a farm or doing some kind of physical labor, that actually that high calorie diet can be very beneficial, and obesity isn't as much of an issue. And there's been debate about is schmaltz actually a healthy fat? I think we're currently on, it is a healthy fat. It's you know, it's liquid at room temperature, so it's actually good for you if it's sustainably sourced. And but it's it's an interesting question. Absolutely.
Another question from an anonymous asker is, what is distinct about Australian Jewish food? I don't know if that's a question that you can ask, but you can answer.
I mean, I would love to hear from the audience impressions of that, because I'm sure there must be elements of Australian Jewish food that maybe you all have encountered, and I'd love to hear from you. Does anyone have thoughts about that?
Someone else suggested earlier that we eat our latkes with Vegemite. It sounds absolutely disgusting.
Is that a common thing in Australia?
I don't know, but it sounds disgusting. Please keep the questions coming if there's anything else. No more questions from anyone. No, quite a quiet group. People agreeing.
I haven't tried it.
Just with Vegemite sounds horrible. No, there don't seem to be any other questions. The course does sound very interesting, Ben.
Yeah, well, again, everyone should have the link. I can put it in the chat. And I can also, oh, go ahead.
I do have a question also. As American Jewish food started to develop, were any of them imported back to Europe? Were American developments in Jewish food becoming popular in, you know, pre-war Poland at all? Or
you know, it's interesting. I know that I'm going to jump topic to answer your question, but with Yiddish theater, and we have a Yiddish theater online course that is a global history of Yiddish theater. That is actually a very prominent phenomenon that is talked about in the scholarly literature, that American Yiddish, you know, Ashkenazi Jews come to New York and they build up this vibrant Yiddish theater. And then the American Yiddish theater actually ends up influencing the Eastern European Yiddish theater. I would have to, I think, again, I would have to check with a few scholars to see what is out there about that. I think it's certainly possible that there was some back and forth. I think the document I showed earlier about the Totzeret Artsenu of having that, you know, import list of, you know, goods from Mandate British Palestine, sort of shows that there was this cross-pollination, but I'm not sure. It would be a good question to investigate. I see that someone does eat matzah with Vegemite, which is...
Renata has said avocado with everything is Australian, which is true. And John has said Ashkenazi food is seen as fatty and undesirable. The Jewish trendy food is Israeli Sephardi. How can we counteract this?
So to that, I mentioned Jeffrey Yaskowitz and Liz Alpern, who taught the course with us, and they have a wonderful cookbook called the Gefilte Manifesto, and it is very much about revitalizing these fermented foods and, you know, foods that are based with fresh produce and some lighter fare. So I think, again, one of the things that happens in the trajectory of the foodway in a broad sense is that when you go through this process of immigration, acculturation, industrialization, the foodway gets kind of whittled down. Whereas in Eastern Europe, perhaps people had better access to wild berries, to foraging mushrooms, to making their own sauerkraut and pickles and things that are naturally, probiotic and very good for you, actually. Especially if you are coming to a new place and you don't have very much money, as many immigrants did not, you turn to the foods that are just available to you. And there are these other elements of the cuisine that I think those of us interested in revitalizing the food way are really trying to promote. So that I would say, yes, there are lighter elements of Ashkenazi Jewish food. It can be, I think, very healthy for you, depending on how you cook it and how you present it. And I think there are opportunities. Of course, Israeli food is delicious, and I love hummus and all of the salads and everything, and Mediterranean food more broadly. But I think there's this undiscovered or less known element to Ashkenazi Jewish food that we can reclaim.
Sounds good. Interesting question from Heidi. How do you think the flavors have changed now after the Industrial Revolution? Are certain ingredients missing or no longer available without organic farming, or changed to have less flavor, for example?
I think it varies so much depending on where you are. If you have, say, access to a farmer's market, you can get, fresh produce. I think there are certain crops that might not grow in certain climates or be readily available. The goose is also a good example of something it was more common to raise geese, and because of industrialization, Jeffrey explains this in his article, it's just not sustainable for many, mass scale agricultural operations to raise geese. They're more temperamental, they're harder to raise. Chickens are easier to produce at mass scale. So that's, again, an argument for figuring out what can grow in your climate and grow locally for you, and how you can adapt, some of these traditional recipes to suit your needs. There's certain things like dill, which is so iconically Eastern European, and used prominently in Ashkenazi Jewish kitchens. So if you're in a climate where it's hard to grow dill, there might be some adaptation that has to happen there. But that's what I would say to that.
Interesting question from Simone. Was there any consciousness of vegetarianism in old Europe?
Oh yes. So Fania Lawando, as I mentioned, she has this restaurant, but there were Jewish vegetarian movements, actually. There were Jewish vegetarian publications in Yiddish. There's a whole body of scholarship on this. Eve Joknowitz, who translated the Vilna Vegetarian Cookbook, gives a lecture in the course on Jews and vegetarianism, and it's fascinating because it was seen as Tsar Belechaim as a Jewish ethic for many Jewish vegetarians to not eat meat. And then of course there are famous Jewish vegetarians like Bashevis Singer and others. So yes, that is a tradition that is rich, and there's a lot of history there.
Saul asked, what were the differences in economic classes in Europe in terms of food? More meat or better fish? How were they distinguished?
Sure. I mean, certainly many people couldn't afford meat on a regular basis. And that's one of the transformations that happens when we looked at the immigrant story to the United States, is that Hasia Diner is the historian who writes about this. The sheer abundance and the quantity, the availability of meat completely changes the whole concept of Jewish eating. Whereas you came from, previously in Eastern Europe, you had meat on Shabbos, you had, a goose or a chicken or for Friday night dinner, and throughout the week you weren't eating meat. Most likely you were having bread, you were having, some butter, schmaltz, fish, things like that, but you weren't having a large quantity of meat. And that changes when Jewish immigrants come to the US, for example. They now can have meat whenever, and that really changes even the whole concept of what it means to have a sort of a sanctified time where you eat meat and you're mostly vegetarian or eating certain lighter fare throughout the week. So yes, and so meat, certainly there were, higher social classes that could afford meat more often, and most people in Eastern Europe historically were not eating meat all that often.
Saul has another question. I'm not sure whether he's referring to pre or post-war, but he said kosher restaurants in Europe, was there any non-Jewish patronage?
I do not know the answer to that question. That is a fantastic question. I'm going to have to look that up and get back to you. So, yeah.
Okay. Okay, the age-old question about salt or sugar. Is this, this is gefilte fish, or just generally speaking, where do we sit? Is it a regional thing? Is it just a family choice?
Right. So the famous debate is that Litvaks have peppery gefilte fish, and Galicianers have sweet gefilte fish. And there's that famous map where you can draw a line between Lithuania and Galicia and say, that's the peppery gefilte fish is over there, and the sweet gefilte fish is over there. There are various interesting explanations for that, but suffice it to say that there was this Galicianer tradition for more sweetness, and Lithuanian tradition for more peppery foods. Some of that might be related to production of sugar and other agricultural factors, or just cultural preferences. But yes, it's a very famous and fun debate. And you can decide where you don't have to choose. I think you can hedge. You can have peppery and sweet.
Okay. Renata's got a funny question about sushi. She said Jewish weddings almost always have sushi. Can sushi become a Jewish food, please?
So, Renata, the hard-hitting questions. I would say, I think it depends on the context. So certainly, I don't know how the kosher sushi scene is in Melbourne. I haven't been, but it sounds like Faye's nodding that there is quite a prominent scene. The same thing in New York. There's the phenomenon of kosher sushi. It's a question if it's eaten in a Jewish context under Jewish dietary laws, is it a Jewish food? There's it's interesting. There's a restaurant in New York that is also featured in the course called Shalom Japan. That is a fusion cuisine of Ashkenazi Jewish food and Japanese food. And I think 100% this is Jewish food. It is a beautiful synthesis because the two chefs, they're married and they made this restaurant together, and they're both extremely talented chefs. And it really is this beautiful synthesis of these flavor profiles. And there are a lot of commonalities, right? You have lox in Ashkenazi Jewish tradition, and you have sushi in Japan. And there's a commonality there, and certain flavors that come forward that they really merge together. So Renata, it's a hard question. I would say it depends on so many factors, and it's perhaps a matter of opinion. That's where I'll leave that. I think we should have a Talmudic debate about
it. Speaking of Asian food, Harry's got a functional question here. He said the course of Chinese food is at 5 a.m. in Melbourne time. Will it be recorded? Because he can't get up so early.
Okay, my apologies for the time zone mistake. It will be recorded, yes.
It'll be recorded. Okay. I think that's all of our questions. Oh no, there was one more. It's an anonymous question. The Eastern European diet sounds healthier than the American Jewish diet. Does it? What's your opinion on, European versus, well, I guess it's pre-war European versus current American. I guess it depends on the kitchen, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think it depends on the context and what American diet you're talking about. Certainly in the States, we have had a tradition of having a great deal of meat, which doctors argue maybe isn't ideal for human health. And I think it also depends on how physically active someone is. As I said, if you're working on a farm and you're working all day, maybe richer foods can be healthy and sustain you and give you the calories you need. I think there are many. You could argue that you could argue it both ways, I'd say. If you go to Fanny Lawando's cookbook, it is a wonderful cookbook and a beautiful, important document. Some of those recipes, even though they're vegetarian, even though they have a lot of vegetables, are quite heavy by current standards. You know, she says, put in this amount of milk, this amount of butter, and it could be a little shocking. They are delicious, of course. So I think tastes do change, and in how people use ingredients change tremendously. And that's what's exciting about this culinary history, is that we get to track all of those changes. But certainly, I think a return to sustainably grown and local fresh ingredients and cooking. There's something very empowering about cooking them at home, fermenting your own pickles or your own sauerkraut. You can ferment beets. There's so many different recipes in the Ashkenazi Jewish kitchen that can be healthy and really sustain us. So I would say figure out what's right for you and what's meaningful, and let's keep the conversation going about it, because it's an endless conversation to have.
Absolutely. And as Anna has just put in the chat, it's we're all hungry now after this. A common response to this course. Thank you so much, Ben. A heartsick dunk. What a fascinating and mouth-watering presentation you've given us. It's been such a pleasure to have you with us today, direct live from New York. We could hear the sirens going in the background during the talk a little bit. And as you mentioned to me earlier before we came online, you have a brother living in Sydney. So we are very much looking forward, when international travel is possible again, to have you join us live in Australia. We would love to have you at Kadimah and discussing your fascinating area of research. Ben is, of course, our final speaker for what has been a truly unprecedented year in terms of what we are able to do, both what has been limited and what has been possible with these international chats. I look forward to seeing you all again in the new year, hopefully in person. Our next live event, The Fig Tree Replanted, will be a concert of music and storytelling on Sunday, the 21st of February, both live and live stream. Save the date and keep an eye out for the announcement in your inboxes next week. A schönen Dank, Ben. A sehr gute Yontif, a freilichen Chanukah. Bleib gesund und bleib stark. Be well, everyone.